One thing that I'm trying to figure out is when I talk to educators, they seem to have one of two basic responses. One is this is evil and must be destroyed. And that comes from a few different places. Sometimes it's a fear of being rendered obsolete. It's a fear of cheating. Sometimes it's a fear that's political, that we don't trust these companies and they could be doing terrible things. Maybe part of a generalized fear of Silicon Valley. I'm compressing a lot into one stage, but that's one mentality I see. The second argues that we need to rethink a lot of our assessment. Now, I haven't heard this in terms of visuals. I only heard this in terms of text. But then the argument comes either we should remove writing completely and move to, say, oral exams or air-gapped machines, or we should just rethink the entire apparatus of assessment. If you're going to be signing papers, how do you come up with different topics? How do you have multiple scaffolds in order to build a system that reduces the chance of plagiarism? I think I'm seeing those two schools. The first is that it needs to be constricted, and the second is it needs to be worked with. How do you see these playing out right now in practice all around you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in terms of the first school, I think there's a certain fear of, well, we've been doing this all along and suddenly this comes along and pretty much makes a lot of the tools we've been using useless, meaningless, etc. But to me, it's interesting how it's focused, right? When people start out with the first thing as, well, students are going to cheat. So, wow, that's the first thing you think about with your students, not what they're going to learn, not what they're going to create, not what lives they want to lead, not what you're thinking about cheating. That's a kind of dark lens to look at things through. And it's not that I want to negate the fact that, yes, in some contexts, students will cheat, or there can be encouragements for different reasons, career pressures, etc. But that to me is a weird way to look at it. To me, it's a question of saying, well, okay, what can we talk about engaging students with so that the motivation for cheating is not there, or so that it's irrelevant in terms of what's going on? So if you've been doing something like assigning the standard 5-paragraph essay on topic X, and that's been your final form of assessment, and that's been your final form of summative assessment, and you make it a very high pressure, okay, so you're going to show me everything you got in this essay and so on. Well, yeah, I'll tell you right now, GPT-4 just came out. I've been testing it. GPT-3.5 was still a little shaky on that. GPT-4 is very good, I have to say, at constructing a standard 5-paragraph essay given a topic and a little bit of coddling along the way. So in theory, you could say, yeah, sure, that's going to be what students are going to do. But you have to be asking the question, why were you asking the students to do this in the first place, right? And if you were doing this as summative assessment, as a way of saying, hey, what have you learned? The truth is, this is a really bad tool for that, because all it generally is doing is asking students to rehash something that they got. And guess what? Yeah, a tool like a large language model like GPT-4 is excellent at rehashing things and will only get better with time. So you're asking your students to perform a task that, frankly, a machine, as we're seeing, can get better and better at doing. But if the reason you were asking your students to write essays was to say, well, look, there are some things I would like my students to have at the front of their mind. So this is a way to get them to put it at the front of their mind. I wanted to do it as a way of, if I ask them to put things together, can I gauge their understanding, how that's coming together and so on? Again, as a form of formative assessment for which there will be a feedback loop and so on. Then suddenly two things happen. Number one, the incentive to cheat, or the worry that people have, tends to recede into the background. Why? Because this is not anymore a kind of, this is the sole thing I will judge you on, but more a question of, listen, I want to see where you're at, how your thoughts are evolving. I will give you a tool for analyzing, examining your own thinking. Then there's not much motivation for cheating. You start to take away the motivation. And number two, the other thing you can start thinking is about, well, okay, absent a tool like GPT, I could assign this writing, but can I change how I do writing with GPT and similar tools in the middle? So I get at richer things. So I might ask my student, for instance, instead of writing the standard 5-paragraph essay, by the way, I've never liked the 5-paragraph form, but we'll say that for another time. I can say, well, okay, let's engage with a topic and let's have the student engage with it using GPT to bring together some arguments, but to go beyond those arguments. So what I'm asking the student is, yes, I'm still asking them to thread together ideas, but I'm giving them, if you will, a partner in construction of that. And this is something we're just, let me be very clear, we're learning how to do that. As the tool evolves, as the tool becomes more useful, etc., we can start doing richer, more interesting things. So just between GPT 3.5 and GPT 4, the world has changed in terms of what I can ask my students to engage with. So I can ask GPT to give me a brief summary of the thinking of philosopher X, right? So I can ask it to tell me, well, tell me what, for instance, Gadamer might have said about this, or tell me what the following school of continental thought as compared to this school of Anglo thought might. So that's easy. That you can get that, but then you can have your students start to interplay with that in ways that do not go to what something like GPT can easily do. And do tell me, does the student understand how this thinking occurs? Does the student understand how to put it together, how to synthesize something from it? So we're just learning how to use these tools. And to me, it's important that we not lock ourselves into what I would call suboptimal ways of using the tool. What do I mean by this? I'm seeing already a rush to saying, oh, we have these tutorial models that we developed using some type of scaffolded platforms, whether it's Khan Academy or another one. And now we can use a tool like GPT-4 to provide directed instruction by engaging with the student in a dialogue about what they understand, what they don't understand. Now that, in first instance, would be indeed an improvement, okay? In SAMR terms, an augmentation over what was being done, because it is responsive to the student to a certain degree. But my question is, we want to be careful, because I don't want to get locked in and say, well, okay, so what I did is I enhanced that mode of instruction and that's it. But what about constructing a whole new platform that could not be constructed without this type of tool that goes beyond what you could do with the type of, standard presentation, video plus quiz structure with some type of responsive structure, etc. Which, if I have to be perfectly frank, hasn't evolved that much other than in terms of software technology on top of it since the 50s. In other words, so for the positive aspects, what I would encourage us to try to do is to think deeply about saying, well, when you have a tool with this type of plasticity, with this type of power, with this type of possible uses, can we take a step back and say, well, we could enhance one of our existing tools? And maybe we start there because that's fine, but we don't just say, and now we call it a day and we're all done. I would encourage us, again, SAMR terms, to push to the modification to redefinition levels, where you're doing something that you couldn't do without the tool.
We need to have that creation, that sense of co-creation and redesign for something that we couldn't do before.
Chatgpt, don't get me wrong, it's a wonderful front end, but it is a front end with certain assumptions, certain limitations, certain conditions imposed upon it, some of which may make sense for an educational audience, some of which may not. And again, if we don't allow that fuller access through our institutions, through whatever media we choose to provide access to, then we immediately create a situation where there is no equity of access, and you get into very, very different conditions of how you can use, how you can think, how you can create with the tool. So I think that's a crucial point, right? If you take just ChatGPT, even 4, and ask it to provide references for something, it will tend to do, after a certain point, what sometimes is called hallucinate. In other words, it creates a new reference, and people say, why is it making up a reference? You have to understand a little bit how the whole GPT ensemble, all large language model tools work. What they're doing is they're finding patterns, right? And initially, you'd say, well, it found a pattern, and the pattern included as part of that pattern where the pattern was sourced. The trouble is, the larger and the more complex the model becomes, the harder it is to keep those references in there. In fact, at some point you have to give up the exact references. So you can do something that would be the equivalent of, this is an approximate, but almost an exercise in recall. I know this is generally true, and I think I saw it there. The trouble is, at some point it starts matching patterns to a there that never existed. It's a little bit as though you said, I know I heard that. It must have been my friend Freddie. Actually, Freddie never said that. But you say it must have been my friend Freddie because in your mind you matched it to this. And one thing I always try to emphasize is, please, the large language models don't even remotely think like a human being does. These are large pattern discovery and pattern matching generation engines. So how do you solve this? Well, the way in which you solve it is you say, look, the large language model works like a reasonable human being might be in terms of its capacity to have a general body of knowledge to interpret things, and that has been growing from model to model. And then for things like references, it has to build upon another body of references, just like you would go and look it up in your library. So you said, instead of saying, I think Freddie told me this, you'd say, let me go to my bookshelves or my virtual bookshelves now, or whatever, a Google Scholar, etc., and make sure I'm remembering correctly where it is. That is where the GPT family is going right now. And you see some of that in BingBot, okay? If you use the Bing engine, it will give you references, and those references are legit. I have not been able to make the BingBot hallucinate. I have been able to make it lose its place, but I have not yet, that doesn't mean it can't be done, been able to have it generate a complete link to a website that doesn't exist. It links to a website. However, BingBot is still very primitive because the quality of the reference websites it links to varies very wildly with respect to the question, even when better websites exist. So for instance, I ran a test on something that would be of interest to any student or in fact, any member of the community who was interested in something relative to environmental rules and protection of the environment and the community and so on. And I found I could get Bing to give me a good answer and give me references, but the references were to low quality sources. And it's an interesting question why they got ranked. We could get into it. I did an analysis later for which ones showed up and why, etc. It was fairly, it was well beyond what most people would want to do. But again, the team is aware of this. I suspect what we're going to see at some point is an option to say, well, I would like to have it point towards this set of sources or to fine tune my sources. So that, for instance, in this particular case, even though government websites, EPA websites, organizations devoted to protection of a particular species or environment all existed, it was going to, as I say, very, very low, third tier sources and so on. So that still needs to be fine-tuned and needs work on. So that's a very long answer. I apologize for that to your point, which is to say that at this point, would I tell students to go out and get sources, references from GPT? No. But what I might do is to say instead, okay, so here's a topic. I give you the references or you find the references, and then you use GPT to help you analyze or understand these references. So that's where I would do it. I would not at this point, even with GPT or Chatgpt 4, give it that task because the hookup to sources is not yet refined enough. I hope it will be, and I'm hoping it will be fine-tuned. So
yeah,
that would be
exactly my concern was that not only were and I'm not an AI person at all. I'm a psychologist, and I was looking at what it produced were also even the ideas where some of them were amalgamations. I happen to know some of the people who are in the field, and I'm like, if somebody cited this about my work, I would be up in arms because I never said that. But it's like similar people might have said something similar, and there was that sort of amalgamation that had me rather concerned. Like, it's not just that it's creating these websites, and they look very good. I use APA format, and they were in APA format and everything with DOIs, and it was all like literally fake.
Yeah.
So
right.
That's
and
the
I-
hallucination.
right. And as I say, no, that's exactly it. And it's important to realize that that is a limitation of the technology
right.
as it is implemented in ChatGPT. And as I say, the crudeness of the approach so far in being GPT. But since you brought this up, there's one more aspect, and I suspect Brian thought I was going to mention this earlier, so I'll mention it now, which is that all of these are commercial efforts. And all of them are associated in one way or another with advertising, the sale of advertising, the sale of a platform, a voice to somebody that wants to sell a product, get a particular message out, and so on. We can work with them as we have all along. That's not anything new. But I would also like to see in parallel, particularly for those of us in academia, what are open source slash, to use the European term, Libre efforts develop in AI, because I think it's going to be crucial for multiple reasons. Number one, the more engines there are out there, the better, the more richly, the more interestingly, I think the field will develop. Number two, having an engine I can look at and look at the source code and look at the body of references material it was trained upon, and to say, oh, I see this working, not working because of this, and I can make sure that I can answer, why did this happen? Well, and I can do more and say, well, that's in the general pattern of hallucination. I can say, well, geez, let me see, because I have the tools to dig specifically into why this particular failure occurred or this particular thing occurred, is, I think, also crucial. So I don't view this as a optional thing. I do view the development of open source Libre AIs as a necessary component as we move forward for, again, full use of this in academia and for, frankly, addressing some of the challenges and potential risks of the existing engines. So that's, I think, one more point that emerges from what you've brought up. So thank you again for bringing up that point.
Thank you.
Just to show you our geographical reach, we are now going to bring on stage a wonderful professor from Armenia. This is Brent Anders, who's been on our stage before. Brent is doing tremendous work on talking about ChatGPT. His Twitter feed is admirable, and his videos are just essential. Brent, welcome.
Thank you, Brian.
Hi, Brent.
Okay, so I have a couple of different comments, so I'll try to be quick. The first thing is the whole idea with the hallucinations. Yeah, that's a big deal. The GPT-4 is supposed to be 40% better, but the hallucinations are still there, right? So now it's a little bit above 80% where it's going to be right, and then there's still around 15 to 20% where there's problems. So, but given that, one of the big things that I'm always pushing for all my instructors, every speech when I talk about ChatGPT, is this idea of AI literacy, of knowing that, hey, it could be wrong. So critical thinking is very important. That means that we have to analyze any response, but that should go without saying. I mean, you're a subject matter expert, but I'm not just taking what you're saying as dogma, right? I still have to critically analyze. But going back to what you just talked about with the professor that was just talking there, the psychology professor. So what I've been recommending, this is kind of unique, I guess, because I'm very much into role play, right? I think that's how students really learn. So I tell them this: you need to increase this idea of how severely wrong it would be to have some sort of reference in any essay, in any article, that's wrong or made up. So now what I tell them is that this is exactly what I would do, is a student submits a paper. And then I would say this, if there was an incorrect made up reference, I would stop the class and say, come up, you're now going to have to go in front of a board because what you committed was something that's extremely bad. It's not just like, oh, you made a mistake. No, you created something wrong. So that means that you didn't do your due diligence and you just lost credibility in the field. Wow, this is a major thing. This isn't some minor problem. This is, wow, you're probably not going to be able to present at conferences anymore. You're not going to be able to be published anymore. This is a major deal. And again, to role play it out so that they have this emotional connection, as opposed to, well, I'm just going to use ChatGPT and turn it in because I'm trying to save time. So again, whatever we can do to really connect some emotion to the process, that's where we're going to make a lot of gains, because that learning process needs to have some emotional connection in order for it to really be retained and to really sink in. So that would be my little recommendation for that last incident. But let me get to my question, right? So with GPT-4 that came out, OpenAI also released an article to help explain GPT-4. And interestingly enough, in their article, they had a whole section there talking about the dangers of over-reliance on any AI model. And it was very interesting because they talked about some of the big dangers of, if we start to use AI for all these other tasks that will, save us time, we're going to actually start to lose skills, which makes a lot of sense. But it's this balance of what we have to do, because on the same day that I read that, and I just released a video talking about the dangers of that, Microsoft just came out with their big presentation talking about Microsoft 365 Copilot. Yeah. And what is it going to do? It's going to totally change how we do work, so that you have a reliance on them to do so much of your in-between work. Summarize this for me, give me drafts really quickly, which is great. I mean, I'm all about productivity. So my question to you then is, what do you see as the proper balance, and how do we express that in the best way to our students to get them to ensure that they have fundamental skills, but then also be able to properly use the AI, because that's going to be required in whatever job they go into, because that's the new reality. But they still, if they lose that fundamental skill, they're not going to be able to be as effective with that AI, and they'll start to lose what right actually looks like. So I'm really interested in your thoughts on that, and if you've given any thoughts as to how we might approach that, because this AI literacy thing, to me, seems like this is what we need to be pushing for in academia, as far as the way things were a couple of years ago, when, the term critical thinking, that has to be part of every single class. That has to be part of, I see AI literacy as the new critical thinking. I mean, critical thinking is part of that, but AI literacy, I see that as being a necessity, an SLO part of every single class from now on, because it's so important. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. And I agree wholeheartedly that it is crucial. I mean, absolutely crucial to get that type of critical relationship to AI. And this is something actually, even before the large language models, I've been working on for quite some time, which is where I get people to try to think of these tools shouldn't be a replacement for your thinking. They shouldn't be a replacement for what you make, how you act. They should be a tool in your tool set for getting at this. And the example I used, I'll go on a slight tangent here because this is a different model from GPT. But when IBM was pushing Watson, and Watson for medicine in particular, they were talking about, and then Watson is going to come in and it's going to interpret all of these things for you. And the implication was always, and you don't need that silly doctor in the middle. And what I would always point out is to say that, look, I don't have the budget that IBM does for Watson, but I could, on a rather beat up little old laptop, I've since upgraded my machine, but this was right before the pandemic. I had a laptop that was already pretty beat up and a few years old. And I could show how, by using some AI tools for image recognition, I say very primitive compared to what you're looking at with the large language models and so on, but very specialized, very focused on how, for instance, you read an X-ray. Say, you work in this region. This region has a problem, for instance, with MDR, XDR, so multi-drug resistant, extended drug-resistant tuberculosis, right? And what you have then is a scenario where your patients don't look like a generic patient. So you can work with the AI to train it to your needs. And now you, working with this, can do triage. You can say right away, okay, given the analysis, this person clearly doesn't have TB. Or given the analysis, this person clearly has TB. And then working together, you can focus on, okay, this is the tricky case. And that's the type of thinking. So I was doing that, as I say, prior to the pandemic, working on different scenarios with the idea that, no, you don't have to buy the big model. And in fact, you can do better than buying the big model if instead you focus on this type of thinking alongside the AI, with it as a tool, focusing on those cases that the work together, so to speak, in a certain sense, gives you a better result than you could get from each chunk on its own. And that goes to the heart of what you're saying, because it's exactly the same situation now with GPT, or for that matter, with some of the image generation models, right, like Stable Diffusion. And to say, so how can I work together with this? And this is where we need to work with our students. And again, we're making this up as we go along. So please understand, I don't have a huge list of, and here are 10,000 examples, and here's the book, you can go out and buy it tomorrow, etc. No, we're inventing right now the examples where we say, look, here's where you using ChatGPT can do something that ChatGPT can't do on its own. You can do on your own, but look at what happens when you have the synergy of the two components, and what do you need to know for that synergy to be effective, which goes to your point, right? And make sure, but we need to create those examples. So you mentioned something earlier, which I think is also an excellent arena, and I know, in fact, all three of us now on stage, I know, are interested in it, which is the whole arena of what you do with games, role-playing, and games. And for instance, if you look at the guest, Brian, that you had on your forum in terms of the whole concept of teaching history via role-playing with reacting to the past, RTTP.
Mm-hmm. Mark Carnes, yes.
Exactly. And one of the things you can do there is you can say, well, can I use ChatGPT to generate what might have been a speech by fill in the blank of whoever in whatever location. So let's pretend this is a speech by Danton, right? Made to a crowd as seeking support, etc. And then ask a student, okay, now critique it. Why would you find this persuasive or non-persuasive? What about you construct your own speech? Okay, now let's have this play out in the role play with your fellow students. Which one of these works, which one doesn't? Why? What does this tell you about history? What does this tell you about motivation? How would you go about finding more data to make your speech even more persuasive? How would you go about, as a historian, right, researching the period, and what could you use from GPT, but what is not there from GPT that you need to bring to the table? How does this influence what you need to know, what you need to learn? So again, I think we need to create this type of experience, but it really very much needs to be something where the students have their hands in the actual machine, for lack of a better term, so they can experiment and feel for themselves, if you will, what's working, what's not working, and where they're going to need to.
I like that. So it's more of this dynamic assessment, more of a skills application. So we're talking about less writing of, let's say, essays to explain what I know, and more opportunity to actually engage and utilize my skills to prove that I can actually go through it, I can actually do it. So simulations would be a great example of that, yeah.
Absolutely. So
thank you.
Thank you. That's a great point.
Thank you very much.
Brent, that's great commentary and a great question. Who says, have you tried GPT-4's new Socratic tutor system? It's quite impressive. And he also shared a link to some examples, which I will now put in the chat for everyone to get a chance to play with. The part I wanted to chime in with was I followed a Wharton University professor to coax ChatGPT into serving as a game master for a simulation, and found that enormously successful and very positive. That kind of role, that strong interlocutor, seems very different from ChatGPT as a text generator. What do you think about this part?
It's an incredibly rich aspect, and you're right. It's a very different use of the pattern engine than what you have when you're just using it for text generation. And that's part of the beauty of large language models, right? This starts to get at some of the directions for research that I was talking about, and for expanding the range of what can happen. Because one of the interesting things is, yes, I have played a little bit with the Socratic tutor as well. It is very intriguing. I haven't pushed it quite yet as hard as I'd like. So I've just begun to push it, but it is very intriguing, and it speaks to possibilities that are, to go to one of the things I was talking about earlier, not locking ourselves into old forms of instruction with just an enhancement from the tool, to say, well, what can we do where a student can use the tool to get better insight into their own patterns of thinking, to get better insight into how they might think, what they might construct, and so on. So those are possibilities. And it's very interesting too, to see when you start pushing GPT-4 in these directions just a little bit, to see where it starts almost, for lack of a better word, and I know what's going on at a mechanical level, but let's metaphorically say, it's almost like it's reaching and saying, well, clearly I didn't reach quite far enough in the patterns. Let me pull this in as well. So it starts to speak to very much a model that can start very focused on, okay, I have an immediate issue here that I need help thinking through and so on. But it builds out a scaffolding, and it's not a pre-established scaffolding that I pre-designed, right? What I call sometimes the abuse of Vygotskian frameworks, etc. It is rather a scaffolding that is helping the student explore new directions. And that's new. In other words, that is really something that we haven't had tools for. So this is an area both for research, exploration, personal development. And again, I emphasize, we're at the beginnings of this. We all need to just start working on it with an open mind, and also know that we're going to come into points where we're going to say, oh, wait, no, that didn't work. Fine. So how do we fix? How do we reroute? And so on. But I agree, it's a fascinating direction and very different from, if connected to the write the paper or summarize this or extract this information for me, etc.